It's been a half-decade question now since COVID. How do we get our kids continuing to learn to, read and write and just do the basics well in Kansas, in Missouri, and across the entire nation? Well, read a great piece this week from Fox News and New York Post columnist Karol Markowitz, who is joining us on KCMO 95.7 FM in Kansas City. And the article is titled, How One State is Getting Education Right by Going Back to the Basics. Karol, good morning. Thanks for being here. For those that didn't read the article, what is that state and what are they doing so effectively?
Well, thanks so much for having me. That state is Louisiana, which was a bit of a surprise to people. I don't think that people think of Louisiana as a heavy hitter in education, but they really have been for the last few years. And what they've been doing right more than anything else is going back to the basics of how to teach math, how to teach reading, not going for fads or cool plans that keep getting pushed on our schools. And they've really returned to what has worked. I mean, things like flashcards, things like intensive tutoring for kids who need it. The main thing that they do is transparency. No parent is going to be surprised at the end of the school year that his kid can't read. They're going to know along the way that things are a problem and they might be able to get help for their kid.
Now, I grew up in an era in, the 90s when flashcards were a thing. When did flashcards stop becoming a thing? What happened to the flashcard?
Well, it was in the last few decades, a lot of our schools have turned to, again, what I call fad programs. So I'm from New York. One of the things that New York did, for example, is they got rid of phonics. And this actually happened in schools across the country. They got rid of phonics and they went into this program of memorization to read. Now, this worked for some kids. I have 3 kids. My older 2 kids learned to read with the memorization program, no problem. My 3rd kid hit school, and it turns out he has an amazing memory. So he can memorize thousands of words and still not know how to read, but everybody around him thinks he knows how to read. He can't sound out words, and, he went to kindergarten during the pandemic. It was his kindergarten year was school year 2020 to 2021, and it really hurt him. Now, we recognized it. I saw right away that he wasn't actually reading, even though he was able to trick everyone around him. And we were able to get him help. But if you're in a situation where you can't get your child a tutor and where nobody will believe you that this kid is not actually reading, which was a hurdle for me. I had to convince people, I know it looks like he's reading, but he memorized everything you told him to memorize. And so these schools have to go back to what has worked. And for example, with reading, what has worked is phonics, teaching kids how to sound out words so that they don't have to memorize the word, so that they don't have to just rely on, I've seen this word before, what does it sound like? But they could actually read.
So with that, I know, your story is one that you've highlighted many times, and many of our listeners will know that story from seeing you on Fox and reading your articles. You're a lifelong New Yorker. You left for Florida during or just after the pandemic. What are the big differences you've noticed between the education system in New York, heavily bureaucratic, versus what you're dealing with now in a much more free and open state in Florida?
So we left 3 years ago. It was January 22, and it was a really difficult decision. My husband and I had been lifelong New Yorkers. We had just finished building our dream house. We thought, that's it. We're going to live here forever, raise our kids here. And then the pandemic hit, and it exposed a lot of things about our school system and about just the culture in New York as well. For example, we lived in a fairly affluent area and it was pretty far left, and everybody sent their kids to either open private schools or they got them tutors or they formed pods. All the while they marched for equity, but they didn't care that the public school kids couldn't go to school and that they weren't able to get the kind of education that they could get with private school, that schools were closed. The difference in Florida is that there's a lot less nonsense. The nonsense that I mean is, when my kids were small in New York, they were protesting against climate change. I mean, this is something that public schools in New York regularly do. They have kids march against, climate change or for gun control or generally against hate. They turn them into these little protesters. In Florida, there's a lot of sanity. There's just, I always say this. When I got to Florida, I realized that liberals weren't all, trying to indoctrinate their own kids, that they also wanted what conservatives want, which is a really good education. So in Florida, there's a sanity and a normalcy in the schools that just did not exist in New York and still doesn't. And I love to see it. I think the kids here thrive. Florida education has improved so much in the last decade. It's gotten just the numbers show that it's doing really well. And I think the back to basics approach can work anywhere.
Karol Markowitz, Fox News and New York Post columnist, is on KCMO Talk Radio. So, like here in Kansas and Missouri, they're trending more towards school choice. We're still not quite there yet. But how have you seen, whether it's in Louisiana, who you wrote about this week, or what you're seeing in Florida, how does added school choice improve the education for all students? What are some trends you're seeing on that front?
Well, it's so obvious that if parents have an option to take their kids out of their local school, they'll really only remove them from that school if the school is not working for their kid. It's not, I think a lot of the people who oppose school choice just think that the local school will shut down. And if it will, that means that the local school was not working for the kids. So in Florida, Governor DeSantis passed universal school choice, but so many people stayed at their public schools because the public schools are generally good, and they have the added thing where they can trust Governor DeSantis to enforce the non-woke stuff that he has done in the last, he's been governor for 6 years now. In the last 6 years, he's made Florida schools largely woke proof. There's teachers, they can't give their personal opinions to the kids about, various nonsense. They have to stay on topic. So a lot of people kept their kids at their local public schools because that's what was working for them. Now, on a national level, it sounds like President Trump is going to push a tax rebate for parents who want to pull their kids from the local public school and send them elsewhere. And I think it's a great idea. I think parents across the country should have the option to get the educational experience for their kids that works for them. Again, wealthy people have always had this. They can always get their kids to what works for them. Why shouldn't everybody have that? And I think that's the message, and I think that that's the correct one.
Well, and it's such a great point to note. School choice has always existed for those of means, right? For those with money. And the irony is that some of the loudest voices going against school choice in our politics and our government oftentimes have their kids in private schools because they have the means to do it. So the hypocrisy always drives me nuts on this issue, Karol.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Corey DeAngelis is a free school choice advocate, and he's always posting all these various politicians who say that they don't want school choice and school choice is going to destroy our public schools, and then they send their own kids to private schools. Well, why shouldn't everybody have that option? Why should the money go to the school and not follow the student? I think it's, again, an obvious thing that the student should get the education that works for them. And if their local public school that usually gets decided by their zip code is not working for them, they should have the option to go somewhere else. And I hope that President Trump is able to accomplish this via tax rebates, because it's a really hard ask to try to get national school choice in any other way. I think the tax rebate way is the way to go on this.
Well, I hope that more people read your piece, and it is an important message for Kansas and Missouri as well. We can learn from what Louisiana is doing and what you guys have going on down in Florida. So thank you so much for being here, Karol. We appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me. Thank you so much.
You as well. Great work there. I will share that article on X at Pete Mundo. That way you can check it out there from Karol Markowitz, writing for FoxNews.com.